Hey everyone, I'm Jake from Jake M Media, and today we'll test out and go through some sample images of the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 Art, a budget option for Canon L-Series. Let's get into it. So the purpose of this video is to help you guys see the overall quality of this lens and know what it's capable of. And to do that, a few days ago I went out with this lens and took a few test images, and in this video we'll be going through the results. So real quick, I just want to go through some of the specifics of the tests that I performed with this lens. Starting off, I used the Canon 6D Mark II for these test photos, so every photo that you see in this video was taken with that camera. Also, for just about every image that I took for this video, I had the camera leveled off on a tripod. That way we could avoid the camera shake as much as possible. I also had the optical stabilization on the lens turned off for all the shots that I took when the camera was on the tripod. However, once I started testing out the optical stabilization, I had to switch it back on, obviously. Another thing is that I focused with live view on the Canon 6D Mark II, and I also used the self timer so we could avoid camera shake even more. And finally, all the images in this video were not sharpened or given any lens corrections in post-processing. With that all said, if you guys at any point throughout this video want to check out the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 Art lens, I'm going to have links in the description down below. Alright, that's enough talk. Let's get into the test photos. Alright guys, so here we are on my laptop taking a look at the images that I took, the test images. This is my first time seeing these images, just as it is yours, so just keep that in mind as we're going through these. So let's get started. We'll first go in and zoom in on the center of the image, and from here it looks great, both at f2.8 on the left and f4.0 on the right. So here's f4, the next one is f5.6, then we have f8, and finally f11 right here. Honestly, I don't really see any differences at all in the quality. However, I watched another test video on this lens, and the guy that was testing it went off to the edges of the frame, and that's where you see the big difference. Like I said, we got f2.8 on the left still and f4 on the right now. If you look at that left image, the words on that cone there are very blurry compared to the f4. So we had f4, now we're on f5.6. That's even better than f4 in my opinion. And then we got f8, that's a little bit better than f5.6 as far as sharpness goes. And then we got f11 here at the end, and honestly I don't see a huge difference between f11 and f8. We got f8 here on the left and f11 here on the right. f11 might be like a hair sharper. So that's it for the first focal length. Now we will move on to the next one. We got 35 millimeters. DxOMark said that 35 millimeters at f2.8, this is where this lens should perform the absolute best. So zooming in to the edges here, we got f2.8 here on the right, or f2.8 here on the left, I mean, and f4.0 here on the right. And looking at these already, I can tell that f2.8 is slightly less sharp than f4.0 looking at these bricks. Anyways, we'll move on. We'll go back to the center of the image here. We got the dealer entrance here. The sharpness on the left side, so the f2.8, is a little bit like not as sharp as the sharpness on the right hand side, so the f4.0. Going down to this trash can, we get the same thing. f2.8 isn't as sharp as f4.0, so we will move on comparing f4 or 2.8 to the rest of the images. So f2.8 on the left still, and then we got f4.0, f5.6 right there. It's a little bit better than f4.0, and then you got f8 compared to f5.6, and honestly there's not a huge difference between these two images. Moving on, we have f11 to finish this image off. There is not a huge difference here at all either. So now here we have 50 millimeters at f2.8 all the way up to f11, just like the others that I've been showing you. We'll start off in the center here, f2.8 here on the left, and f4.0 here on the right. left, f4.0 is slightly, maybe a hair sharper than f2.8. Looking at the corners of this image, looking at the bricks, we got f2.8 looking a little bit more blurry than f4.0 still, and then moving on to f5.6, it's still even sharper than f4.0. And then moving on to f8, we actually have another slight increase in sharpness, and then f11, there's not a big increase in sharpness there. So now we'll move on to the next image, which is 70 millimeters for the focal length. So we got 70 millimeters at f2.8 here on the left and 70 millimeters at f4.0 here on the right. So we got 2.8 looking a little bit more blurry in the center of the image, very close, but it's just a hair sharper on the f4.0 compared to f2.8. Going to the edges of the image, looking here at this wood on this door frame, we have f2.8 still looking a little bit blurrier than f4.0, and we will scroll on to f5.6, f8. There's not a big difference, honestly, between these edges. Like, if you just glanced over this, you would probably not be able to tell the f2.8 here on the left is a little bit more blurry than f4.0 here on the right, or actually we were at f8.0. But still, with any of the other apertures, there's not a big difference. All right, and now we're moving on to our second location for this test. We have f2.8 here on the left, and then f4.0 on the right. f2.8 is definitely blurrier here on the left. Going through these images from f4.0 to f5.6, it gets slightly sharper as we go through. All right, and then we'll go take a look at the edges. Looking at this water actually helps a lot. So we have f2.8 on the left again, f4.0 on the right, and we will scroll through. Looking at that, that's a huge difference in sharpness. This is f8.0 here on the right compared to f2.8 on the left. That is a huge difference in sharpness. And then f11, not a big difference there from f8.0 to f11. Looking at the trees, sharpness again, it's much better on the right hand side than the left hand side. And now we'll move on to the next focal length, which is 35 millimeters. 35 millimeters at f2.8, looking a hair blurrier than 35 millimeters at f4.0 on the right. Again, it gets slightly sharper as we go through in the center of the image. And then we'll go over to the edges. A little bit blurrier here on f2.8, but it gets a little sharper as we go through these images. Looking at these pillars here, actually, 5.6 is a pretty big difference compared to f4.0. So we got f4.0 on the left and f8 on the right. That is a huge difference in sharpness, in my opinion. Okay, and then moving on to the next focal length, which was 50 millimeters. We got f2.8 on the left, f4.0 on the right. There's not a big difference at all in the center of these images. But going over to the edges, we do see a difference in the sharpness on the edges of the frame. Looking at the mill end lofts here, they look much sharper at 5.6 and 8.0, and even f11 for that matter. But 4.0 and 2.8, they're still pretty blurry at these edges. All right, and then we have 70 millimeters at f2.8 here on the left, 70 millimeters at f4.0 here on the right. f4.0, f5.6, f8, and then f11. Again, there's not a huge difference here at the center of the image. I'm assuming when we go off to the edges of the frame, it is slightly sharper. This is where I see it a little bit more. f2.8 looks pretty blurry, and then we got f4.0 looking still pretty blurry. Not a huge difference there, but then we go to f5.6. That's where you see the big jump in sharpness. Compared to f2.8, once again, the difference between sharpness is pretty significant. Okay, and then we're moving on to our third location, which was at the college. 24 millimeters at f2.8 on the left and then f4.0 on the right. Looking at the center of the image here, there's not a big difference in sharpness. Then we go over to the edges. Once again, big difference in sharpness here. f2.8 looking pretty blurry, f4.0 slightly better, and then f5.6 even better yet. f8 slightly better than 5.6, f11 slightly better than 8.0. All right, moving on, we have the next focal length, 35 millimeters, f2.8 on the left, f4.0 on the right. Zooming in to the center of the image, again, not a big difference in sharpness. Going over to the edges, though, we are going to see a big difference here in this tower. And then comparing f2.8 to f11, there is a huge difference there in sharpness. Huge difference. Moving on to 50 millimeters. Virtually no difference in sharpness. Going over to the edges, looking at the edges, there is definitely a huge difference, big difference in these edges here at f2.8 and f11 or 8.0 or 5.6. And finally, for this location, we have 70 millimeters at f2.8 on the left, 70 millimeters at f4.0 on the right. That is actually a decent difference in sharpness. But once again, going over to the edges, you see the grass here, it is much blurrier on the left, but on the right, it is way sharper. And the right is f11, the left is 2.8. But f8.0 and f11, they are much sharper than this 2.8 here on the left. Moving on to the final location. Again, zooming into the center of this image, we got the water tower here, f2.8 on the left and f4.0 on the right. We got f4.0, f5.6, f8, and f11. Not seeing a huge difference in sharpness once again in the center of these images. But let's see what happens when we go to the edges. We got f2.8 looking really blurry, just like with every other image. f4.0 a little bit better, and then f5.6, that's where we see the big difference between f2.8 and 5.6. And then f8, that one is actually really sharp in my opinion. And then f11, that is even sharper than f8. All right, and then the next focal length, which is 35 millimeters. Zooming into the center, maybe a slight jump in sharpness in the center of the image. Again, not a big difference. And then zooming into the edges of the frame, we got definite difference in sharpness when it comes to f2.8 and f4.0. Not really, but then once you get to 5.6 through f11, that's where you see the big jump. Then we got 50 millimeters. Zooming into the center, we have f2.8 and all the other apertures looking very similar in the center of the image. Go to the edges. Let's see what happens. Big jump in sharpness around 5.6 to f11. And the final focal length for this location is 70 millimeters. Zooming into the center, we got f2.8 on the left and f4.0 on the right. Then f5.6, f8, and f11. Not a big difference in sharpness. Then going up to the corners, we do see a big difference there at f2.8 and f11 once again. And even, we see a big jump from f8 and f11 there actually. We got f8 on the left and f11 on the right. So like I've been saying, f5.6 to f11 is probably the range you want to be in for using this lens. Alright, and moving on, we have the image stabilization testing. And so starting off, we have 1/15 of a second here on the left and 1/10 of a second here on the right. And I did make a slight mistake because here on the left, I took it at f5.6. And then on the right, I took it at f7.1. So the left image might be a little bit sharper, but that's just because I used different apertures, which was proved in this testing that f8.0 is going to be a little bit sharper than f5.6. So keep that in mind. With that said, the 1/15 of a second is still very sharp, even compared to this image on the right, which is oddly sharper than the one on the left, even though the one on the right was taken at a slower shutter speed. So this is a big deal right here, that the image stabilization performed this well. Moving on, we went to 1/5 of a second, and this is at f10, and you can see the motion blur, but when you're zoomed out, you definitely cannot see it at all. But if you're zooming into 100%, yes, you will see the motion blur, but nobody's going to do that, and I'm sure if you printed this image, it would look perfectly fine. Even if people got very close to the image, depending on how large the print is, you're not going to see that motion blur. And then moving on from this image, we have the next one, which is taken at 0.3 seconds. And here you see a lot of motion blur, and it's definitely not the issue of too shallow of an aperture or too shallow of a depth of field, because we're at f13 over here on the information, the metadata right there. So it's definitely not that issue. So this is 100% camera shake right here, and if you did print this image, you would probably see this one a little bit more, just because it's a little bit more intense than this last image we looked at. And then I took it even a hair further at 0.4 seconds, and this is even worse than the last image. If you were going to put these on the internet, they might be usable. Like if you're going to put them on Facebook or something, they might be a little usable. There's still a lot of camera shake here that you can see in the Apple. And keep in mind, I had a lot of points of contact when I took these photos because I was bent over and I had 2 elbows on both of my knees, and then I had the camera strap wrapped around my neck, and I had my arms locked in real tight. So just keep that in mind with all these images. We have the next 5, which we're taking at 70 millimeters. This first one was taken at 70 millimeters at 1/15 of a second, and the aperture is f5.0. This one is very sharp, considering that I shot it handheld. And then moving on to the next image, 1/10 of a second at f8.0. Looking at the difference here, there might be a difference. The second one might be a little bit sharper just because I'm at f8.0, but as far as camera shake goes, I don't think that's a huge factor here. It might be more so the change in aperture. And then with this next one, we dropped it down to 1/5 of a second. And here you can see a big difference. The reason this one looks way blurrier than the 24 millimeters at 1/5 of a second is because you're zoomed out further. So we're at like a telephoto range here compared to a wide angle, which isn't going to show that camera shake as much as a telephoto zoom. And then after that 1/5 of a second, we moved on to 0.3 seconds. And here you can obviously see the camera shake. The image stabilization did practically nothing to help here. I mean, if you didn't have the image stabilization for this photo, it probably would have come out even blurrier than this, but this is completely unusable. And then even after that, we dropped it down to 0.4 seconds, so it gets even blurrier here. Okay, and now for the final test, which was the vignetting test. Also, all of these images that are testing the vignetting of this lens were taken at 70 millimeters. I took others at 24 millimeters, but I ended up deleting them because I didn't see any difference in the vignetting compared to 70 millimeters. So for this first image, I took it at 70 millimeters, ISO 200, f2.8, and 1/125th of a second. And from what we can see here, we do see some vignetting around the edge of the frame, and comparing that to the next one, you can definitely see that vignette go away for the most part. So there's f2.8. This one's f4.0. You can still see it on f4.0, but then once you get to f5.6, it pretty much goes away. So f5.6, and then you have f8.0. I realize the exposure is a little lower than the f5.6, but you can't see that vignetting anymore. And then you have f11, and at this point, the vignetting is completely gone. So if you're going to use this lens and you don't want any vignetting coming straight out of camera, then I would recommend shooting above 5.6 for the aperture. So 5.6 looks great, 8.0 looks great, and f11 still looks great. But f4.0 and f2.8, you'll still see a little bit of vignetting around the edges. Alright guys, I hope all those test images were able to help you understand the quality of the photos coming out of the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 and the capabilities of it as well. And again, if you guys do want to check out the Sigma 24-70 f2.8 art lens, there are links down in the description below. Also, if you guys want to see more videos just like this one, subscribe by clicking right here. Anyways, thanks for watching, and always remember to capture great moments.